I didn't learn the truth because someone loved me enough to sit me down and tell it gently. There was no careful conversation, no trembling confession wrapped in remorse. I learned it because my aunt thought I was asleep and because people are careless when they think no one is listening. It was late August, the kind of afternoon where the heat presses against the windows and makes the air feel heavy with things unsaid. We were at my grandmother's house, the yellow brick one that had hosted every holiday of my life. The curtains were half drawn, sunlight cutting the room into pale gold stripes. The ceiling fan spun lazily above me as I stretched out on the old floral couch. The television murmured in the background, some game show my grandmother loved. I remember thinking how ordinary everything felt. I remember thinking how safe. I was drifting somewhere between sleep and awareness when I heard my name spoken in the kitchen, not loudly, not urgently, just carefully, like it had weight. She still doesn't know? That was my Aunt Marlene's voice, sharp and impatient as always. I didn't move. Something about the tone made my body go still before my mind understood why. My mother answered in a low voice that sounded stretched thin. No. And she doesn't need to. The words slid into me like cold water. Doesn't need to know what. My eyes stayed closed, my breathing slow, because instinct told me this was a door that would shut if I revealed I was awake. The house creaked softly, dishes clinked, cicadas screamed outside. Everything else was normal. "You really think she won't figure it out?" Marlene pressed. "Especially now." The word now lingered in the air like a warning siren. My heart shifted its rhythm, thudding harder against my ribs. There was a scrape of a chair, then my mother exhaled slowly. "We've managed this long." Managed. That wasn't a word you used for birthday surprises or minor misunderstandings. You managed crises. You managed damage. I felt the first thread of fear tighten in my chest. My grandmother hummed faintly in the background, oblivious or pretending to be. "She deserves to know," Marlene said again, softer this time but more certain. My mother's reply came quick and tense. "After everything that happened? You want to talk about what she deserves?" The room seemed to shrink around me as the silence thickened. I focused on the sound of the ceiling fan, steady and mechanical, trying to anchor myself. Then Marlene said something that cracked my world open. "You saw the letter. It's not speculation anymore." Letter. My pulse roared in my ears. I pictured envelopes, handwriting I didn't recognize, secrets folded into paper. My mother's voice sharpened. "I burned it. Burned it. You don't burn things that are harmless. You burn proof. You burn things that threaten the story you're trying to keep intact." I felt my stomach drop as if the couch beneath me had vanished. "She's not even his," Marlene said quietly, and the words didn't just land, they detonated. The television audience laughed on cue at some joke I couldn't hear. Outside, a car passed down the street. Life continued, indifferent to the way my reality had just split. Not even his. My mind raced through memories of the man I had called Dad for 26 years. His deep laugh, the way he squeezed my shoulder when he was proud, the smell of motor oil on his hands. I waited for my mother to deny it, to scoff, to correct her sister. Instead, I heard her hiss, "Lower your voice." That was confirmation enough. "So it's true," Marlene said. There was no accusation in her tone now, only inevitability. My mother didn't answer directly, and that silence said everything. I felt as if I were floating outside my own body, watching this scene from somewhere near the ceiling fan. "If this comes out, it will destroy him," my mother whispered. "Destroy him, not us, not me, him." That detail lodged in my chest like a shard of glass. Whatever this secret was, it wasn't about protecting me. It was about protecting the man who might not even be my father. I had spent my whole life believing family meant shared blood and shared loyalty. Now both felt negotiable. "She looks like him," Marlene insisted, almost pleading. "You can't deny that." My mother gave a small, bitter laugh. "Timing matters more than faces." Timing. I did the math without meaning to. Dates, anniversaries, the year I was born. I tried to remember if there had ever been a gap, a story that never quite lined up. "I made a choice," my mother said finally, her voice heavy but firm. I did what I had to do to keep this family together. A choice. That word echoed louder than the rest. Someone had chosen my reality for me. Someone had decided that ignorance was kinder than truth. Footsteps approached the hallway and panic flickered through me. I let my arm slide off the couch as if I were shifting in sleep. A second later, I sensed her presence in the doorway. My mother stood there watching me. I could feel her eyes scanning my face, searching for any sign that I had heard. I kept my breathing slow, my expression slack. After a moment, she stepped closer and brushed a strand of hair from my forehead. "My sweet girl," she whispered. The tenderness in her voice felt different now, layered with something that tasted like guilt. She walked away, and the house settled back into its ordinary sounds. Only then did I open my eyes. The ceiling fan kept turning, steady and unconcerned, but nothing inside me was steady anymore. Not my name, not my history, not the man I had called Dad. I didn't know what the letter had said, or who it had come from, or what timing truly meant. I only knew that my life had been carefully managed, edited like a story where certain pages were torn out before I could read them. And as I lay there staring at the spinning blades above me, I understood something with terrifying clarity. I was the only person in that house who didn't know who I really was. I didn't confront them that afternoon. I didn't storm into the kitchen demanding answers, even though every nerve in my body was screaming to. Instead, I stayed on that couch until the conversation dissolved into the safe, shallow topics families use to cover cracks. When I finally stood up, I stretched like someone waking from a nap and asked if there was any pie left. My mother smiled too quickly. My aunt studied my face a second too long. If they suspected I had heard anything, they didn't show it. And I realized something in that moment that changed the way I would move from then on. If the truth had survived this long in silence, it wouldn't be handed to me easily. I would have to earn it. The drive home felt different, though nothing outwardly had changed. My mother talked about traffic, about my grandmother's blood pressure, about a sale at the grocery store. I watched her hands on the steering wheel. I had inherited those hands, or so I had always been told. The same long fingers, the same small scar near the thumb. I wondered suddenly if that was the only inheritance that was certain. "You're quiet," she said lightly. I shrugged and looked out the window. "Just tired." It wasn't a lie. The kind of exhaustion that comes from discovering your life may not belong to you is bone deep. That night, I pulled out old photo albums from the hallway closet. They were thick and dusty, corners worn soft from years of being opened and closed. I spread them across my bed like evidence in a courtroom. There I was at 5, sitting on my father's shoulders at the county fair. There at 10, grinning with a gap-toothed smile, while he held up a bike he'd just assembled. There at 16, standing awkwardly between my parents at a school awards ceremony. We looked like a family. We looked whole. I searched for signs of distance, of doubt, of something forced. But photographs are masterful liars. They freeze moments, not truths. I studied my father's face in every image, comparing it to mine in the mirror. The same dark eyes, the same slope of nose. Or had I only believed that because I'd been told to? Confirmation bias is powerful. If you grow up hearing you look like someone, your brain obliges. It stitches similarities where there may be none. I zoomed in on a picture from my high school graduation. His arm was around me, pride unmistakable. Was it real, or was it relief that no one had questioned the narrative? My chest tightened at the thought. If he knew, had every hug been layered with deception, sleep didn't come easily. My mind replayed the words over and over. She's not even his. Timing matters more than faces. I burned it. The letter haunted me most. Who sent it? What did it prove? And why now? Marlene had said, especially now. That suggested something had shifted recently, something that made the secret unstable. I thought about the last few months. My father had been distant, quieter than usual. He and my mother argued more often behind closed doors. I had chalked it up to stress. Now I wasn't so sure. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I told my boss I had a migraine, which wasn't entirely untrue. My head felt like it was full of glass. Instead of staying home, I drove to my parents' house. They were both at work, which meant I had a narrow window. My key still worked. The familiarity of the hallway felt surreal, like I was trespassing in a museum of my own childhood. I went straight to my father's office. He kept important documents in a locked filing cabinet, but he was predictable. The spare key was taped inside the bottom drawer of his desk. It had been there since I was a teenager. My hands trembled as I unlocked the cabinet. Insurance papers, tax returns, mortgage statements. I sifted through folders carefully, trying to leave everything exactly as I found it. No letter, no hidden envelope. I moved to my mother's desk in the bedroom. She was less organized, but more sentimental. Old birthday cards, receipts, church bulletins. Then, tucked inside a hardcover Bible on her nightstand, I found something that made my breath hitch. A thin stack of photocopied papers, folded twice. Not the original letter, but something close enough. The top page was a lab report. I recognized the format immediately: DNA paternity analysis. My vision blurred for a second before snapping back into focus. Names were blacked out with thick marker, but dates were visible. The test had been conducted 26 years ago, weeks before I was born. My throat went dry. Beneath the redacted names was a single line that mattered more than anything else. Probability of paternity, 0%. Excluded, excluded. The word felt clinical, detached, but it detonated just as violently as my aunt's whisper the day before. I wasn't guessing anymore. I wasn't paranoid. I wasn't misinterpreting overheard fragments. There it was in sterile font. Science had confirmed what my family had buried. The man who had raised me was not my biological father. I sank down onto the edge of the bed, the papers shaking in my hands. 1,000 memories collided with this new fact, and none of them rearranged themselves neatly. He had been there for every scraped knee, every school recital, every heartbreak. Biology hadn't made him show up, choice had, and yet he had also chosen silence. He had chosen to let me build my identity around a truth he knew wasn't complete. That betrayal cut differently. It wasn't absence, it was omission. I folded the papers back exactly as I had found them and returned everything to its place. As I locked the filing cabinet and stepped back into the hallway, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked the same eyes, same mouth, same familiar face, but now it felt like a mask I had been wearing without knowing it. I had spent 26 years answering the question, "Who are you?" with confidence. Daughter, only child, carbon copy of my dad. Now the first answer felt unstable. Driving home, I didn't cry. Not yet. Shock has a way of numbing you before it lets you feel. Instead, a different emotion began to take shape beneath the surface. Determination. If the truth had been hidden this carefully, there was more to it than a single lab report. Who was my biological father? Did he know I existed? Was I the result of an affair, a mistake, a choice my mother regretted? The questions multiplied faster than I could contain them. By the time I pulled into my driveway, one thing was certain. I could pretend I hadn't seen those papers, just like I had pretended to sleep on my grandmother's couch. I could let them keep managing the story, or I could confront it head-on and risk blowing up everything we had left. The old version of me might have chosen comfort, the girl who believed families were fragile and secrets were necessary. But that girl had disappeared the moment I read the word excluded. This wasn't just about biology anymore, it was about ownership of my own narrative, and I was done being the last person in the room to know who I was. I didn't confront them that afternoon, even though every instinct in me wanted to march into the kitchen and demand the truth. Instead, I stayed still until the conversation dissolved into safer topics, the kind families use to smooth over cracks. When I finally stood up, I stretched and rubbed my eyes like I had just woken from a nap. I asked if there was any pie left, keeping my voice light and ordinary. My mother smiled too quickly, the corners of her mouth tight. My aunt looked at me a second longer than usual, as if searching for something in my face. If they suspected I had heard them, they didn't say it. The rest of the visit passed in careful normalcy, but beneath every word, I felt the hum of something unstable. I understood then that if the truth had survived this long, it would not be handed to me gently. The drive home felt heavier than the humid air outside the car. My mother talked about small things, grocery sales and church meetings, like nothing had shifted. I watched her hands on the steering wheel and wondered how many secrets those hands had carried. Every red light felt longer than usual, every silence sharper. When she asked why I was so quiet, I shrugged and said I was tired. That much was true, though not in the way she thought. The kind of exhaustion that follows the collapse of certainty is different from physical fatigue. It seeps into your bones and changes the way you sit inside your own skin. I looked at her profile and tried to read it differently. Was there guilt there, or just fear of what might unravel? I didn't recognize the woman beside me in the same way anymore. That night, I pulled down the old photo albums from the top shelf of my closet. They were thick with plastic sleeves and fading ink, heavy with history I had trusted completely. I spread them across my bed like pieces of evidence. There were pictures of me as a baby in my father's arms, his smile wide and proud. There were birthday parties, school recitals, vacations at the lake. In every frame, we looked like what we claimed to be, a whole family. I studied our faces side by side, looking for confirmation of what I had always believed: the same dark eyes, the same stubborn chin, the same crooked smile. Or had I imagined those similarities because I needed them? I zoomed in on a photo from my high school graduation, my father's arm around my shoulders. Was that pride uncomplicated or layered with knowledge he never shared? The more I looked, the less certain I became. Memory is powerful, but it is also obedient to the stories we tell ourselves. I had grown up hearing that I was my father's twin, that I inherited his temper and his laugh. I had repeated those claims with confidence, weaving them into my identity. Now I wondered how much of that was suggestion. If you tell a child something long enough, it becomes truth in their mind. I closed one album and opened another, searching for some crack in the timeline. Was there a period when my parents seemed distant? A gap that I had overlooked? Everything appeared seamless, but I knew better now. Seamless does not mean honest. It often means carefully maintained. Sleep barely touched me that night. I lay awake, replaying the words I had overheard. She's not even his. I burned it. Timing matters more than faces. Each phrase looped through my mind, sharp and relentless. The letter haunted me most, the idea that proof had once existed in ink and paper. Someone had written something that threatened the structure of my life, and my mother had chosen fire over explanation. I wondered what it had said, who had sent it, and why it surfaced now. My aunt's voice echoed again in my head, especially now. That implied change, movement, something new. Secrets tend to resurface when circumstances shift. I tried to pinpoint what had shifted recently, but the answers felt just out of reach. By morning, I knew sitting still would drive me insane. I called in sick to work, claiming a migraine, and drove straight to my parents' house. They were both at their jobs, which gave me a narrow window of privacy. My key still fit the lock, the familiar click sounding louder than it ever had. Walking inside felt like stepping into a museum dedicated to my childhood. The hallway photos, the faint scent of coffee, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, everything was exactly as it had always been, which somehow made it worse. I wasn't looking for drama anymore. I was looking for confirmation, and confirmation rarely sits in plain sight. I started in my father's office, where important documents were kept in a locked filing cabinet. I knew where he hid the spare key. He had never been as discreet as he believed. My hands trembled as I unlocked the drawer and flipped through the folders. Tax returns, insurance policies, mortgage papers, all ordinary, all legitimate. I moved carefully, aware that even a slight disruption could expose me. There was no obvious letter, no envelope marked urgent. I closed the cabinet and stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet house. Then I went to my parents' bedroom, where my mother kept her own small desk. If anyone preserved sentimental secrets, it would be her. Her drawers were cluttered with birthday cards, old receipts, church programs, and folded scraps of paper. I sifted through them slowly, trying not to leave evidence of my search. Inside the nightstand, tucked into a hardcover Bible, I found something different. A thin stack of photocopied papers, folded twice, hidden but not destroyed. My pulse quickened as I unfolded them. The top page was unmistakable, a laboratory report, sterile and clinical. DNA paternity analysis. My vision blurred for a second before snapping back into focus. Names had been blacked out with thick marker, but the dates were clear. The test had been conducted 26 years ago, weeks before I was born. I read the single line that mattered most, the one that erased any lingering doubt. Probability of paternity, 0%, excluded. The word felt cold, almost polite in its detachment. Excluded from fatherhood, excluded from biological certainty, excluded from the narrative I had carried my entire life. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the papers shaking in my hands. Shock didn't arrive loudly, it settled in quietly, like dust after a collapse. The truth was no longer theoretical or overheard, it was printed, documented, confirmed. The man who raised me was not my biological father, and both of my parents had known from the very beginning. I folded the papers exactly as I had found them and placed them back inside the Bible. I returned every drawer to its previous state and locked the filing cabinet before leaving. When I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror, I paused. I looked exactly the same as I had the day before. Same eyes, same mouth, same familiar face. But now that face felt like a mask worn without consent. For 26 years, I had answered questions about who I was with confidence. Daughter, only child, my father's twin. Now those answers felt unstable, like stepping onto ground that might give way. Driving home, I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I simply understood that my life had been carefully edited, and I had just found the missing page. I didn't tell anyone what I had found, not that day and not the next. I carried the knowledge like something fragile and radioactive at the same time. It sat in my chest, heavy but invisible, altering the way I moved through the world. At work, I answered emails and nodded through meetings, but everything felt slightly misaligned. When someone asked about my family, I hesitated before responding. The word father hovered differently on my tongue now. It no longer meant something simple. It meant layers, omissions, decisions made long before I had a voice. I found myself studying people's faces more closely, wondering how much of identity is performance. How many of us are walking around built on stories that aren't entirely true? The question followed me everywhere. By the third day, silence felt like complicity. I couldn't unknow what I had seen, and pretending I didn't know felt like betraying myself. So I called my parents and asked them to come over for dinner. I kept my tone casual, almost cheerful. My mother sounded relieved, as if she had been waiting for reassurance that everything was still normal. My father agreed without hesitation. I spent the afternoon cooking his favorite meal, moving carefully through each step. There was something almost cruel about preparing comfort before delivering disruption, but I needed the setting to be steady. If the truth was going to be spoken out loud, I wanted it grounded, not chaotic. When they arrived, they looked exactly as they always had. My mother carried a bottle of wine and kissed my cheek. My father squeezed my shoulder in that familiar way that once meant safety. For a brief second, I nearly abandoned the plan. It would be easier to live in partial ignorance than to fracture what remained intact. But ease is not the same as honesty. We sat down to eat, and conversation drifted through safe territory. Work complaints, neighborhood gossip, church updates. I watched them both carefully, hyper-aware now of every shared glance. I wondered how many years they had practiced this choreography of silence. After dinner, when the plates were cleared and the wine glasses half empty, I stood up and retrieved the folder from my desk. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I placed the photocopied report on the table between us. The air shifted immediately. My mother's breath caught before she even looked down. My father stared at the paper without touching it. "I found this," I said quietly. There was no accusation in my tone, only fact. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet felt dense, like something physical pressing against us. My father reached for the paper first. He scanned it slowly, jaw tightening as if he were reliving the moment he had first read it decades ago. My mother didn't look at the report. She looked at me. "How much do you know?" she asked softly. "Enough to understand that I wasn't told the whole truth," I replied. My voice didn't shake, though my heart pounded against my ribs. "I deserve to hear it from you." The words felt firm but not cruel. This wasn't about punishment, it was about clarity. My father leaned back in his chair and rubbed his forehead. "We were separated," he began, "for a few months before you were born." I looked at my mother, who nodded slowly. "It was a difficult time," she added. "We didn't think we would find our way back to each other." The explanation sounded rehearsed, like something they had told themselves many times. "And during that time," I prompted gently. My mother's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "I met someone," she said. The simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any dramatic confession could have. "It wasn't meant to last," she continued. "It was a mistake made in loneliness." I didn't interrupt, even though part of me bristled at the word mistake. I was the outcome of that mistake. "When I found out I was pregnant, I told him," she said. "He didn't want to be involved." My father's voice entered then, steady but edged with old hurt. "We did the test before you were born," he said. "The results were clear." I swallowed, though I already knew what he meant. "And you stayed," I said. He nodded. "Yes, because you were never a mistake to me." The words landed with a complicated warmth. Choice, commitment, those were powerful things, but they didn't erase omission. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. My mother reached for my hand, and this time I let her. "We thought we were protecting you," she said. "From rejection, from confusion, from the possibility that you'd go looking for someone who didn't want to be found." "That wasn't your decision to make for me," I replied, not angrily but firmly. My father met my eyes. "You're right," he said. The admission surprised me. There was no defensiveness in it, only acceptance. "We were afraid that telling you would change the way you looked at us," he added. I considered that carefully. The truth was, it had, but not in the way they feared. I didn't see monsters across the table. I saw flawed people who had made a choice and carried it for years. "Does he know about me?" I asked finally. My mother hesitated only a second. "Yes," she said. "He signed away his rights before you were born." The finality of that statement cut deeper than I expected. It meant I had been deliberately excluded from someone's life before I had even entered it. "Is he alive?" I asked. "Yes," my father answered, "and he lives here." The proximity startled me more than anything else. The idea that my biological father had been walking the same streets all these years felt surreal. "I want his name," I said quietly. My mother's instinct was to resist, but she stopped herself. My father stood up, walked to the kitchen counter and grabbed a pen. He wrote the name on the back of an old receipt and slid it toward me. I stared at the unfamiliar letters. They meant nothing and everything at once. This was the man whose DNA shaped half of me, the man who had chosen absence. I folded the paper carefully and placed it in my pocket. "I'm still your dad," my father said softly as they prepared to leave. I nodded. "You are," I replied, "but now I need to know the rest of the story." I didn't look up his name that night. I could have. It would have taken less than a minute to type it into a search bar and begin unraveling whatever version of him existed online. But some part of me needed space between knowing and acting. The receipt with his name on it sat on my kitchen counter, weighted down by my keys, as if it might float away if left unattended. I walked past it several times, each glance tightening something in my chest. The name felt foreign, like a word in a language I was supposed to understand but didn't. For 26 years, I had lived without it. Now it pulsed quietly at the center of everything. The next morning, curiosity overpowered hesitation. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and typed the name slowly, letter by letter. The search results populated instantly. A LinkedIn profile, a business website, a few old news articles. He wasn't a mystery figure living in shadows. He was ordinary, visible, documented. He owned a small construction company in the city. There was a headshot attached to one of the articles, taken at some local business award ceremony. I stared at the image longer than I meant to. He looked normal. Mid-50s, broad shoulders, salt and pepper hair, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I clicked on another photo, this one from a company picnic posted on social media. He stood with a group of employees, arms slung casually around a younger man who resembled him closely. My breath caught. A son, maybe. The resemblance was obvious in a way that made my stomach twist. Same jawline, same posture. The comments beneath the photo congratulated him on building a family business. The word family felt almost mocking. I studied his face, searching for pieces of myself. The curve of his nose looked faintly familiar. Or maybe I was projecting again, trying to stitch connections where there might be none. Scrolling further, I found an address listed on a public directory. He lived less than 20 minutes from my apartment. The proximity felt surreal, like discovering a hidden room inside a house you've lived in your whole life. All those years of crossing streets and standing in grocery lines, and I could have been standing behind him without knowing. The thought unsettled me more than outright distance would have. If he had moved across the country, it would have implied escape. Staying nearby suggested indifference. It suggested that knowing I existed hadn't changed his geography at all. For the rest of the day, I functioned on autopilot. I answered emails, returned calls, nodded through conversations, all while his face hovered in my mind. I found myself wondering about the details no website could provide. Did he ever think about me? Did he ever calculate my age on my birthday? Did he drive past my high school at graduation time, aware that somewhere in that crowd I might be standing? Or had I been neatly compartmentalized, a closed chapter filed away decades ago? The not knowing gnawed at me more than anger would have. That evening, I drove past the address I had found online. I didn't plan to stop, I just needed to see it, to confirm that it existed outside the abstract. The house was modest, but well maintained, with a trimmed lawn and a basketball hoop in the driveway. A pickup truck was parked out front, company logo printed neatly on the side. I slowed as I passed, my heart hammering in my ears. A teenage boy was shooting hoops alone, earbuds in, unaware of the car creeping by. I wondered if he was the younger version of the man in the picnic photo. I wondered if he knew he might have a half-sister driving past his house. I didn't park. I didn't get out. I circled the block once, then twice, memorizing the shape of the house. The windows were dark except for one in the front room. A silhouette moved briefly across the light. My breath caught involuntarily. Was that him? The man who had signed away his rights to me before I was born? The idea that he was inside, perhaps eating dinner, perhaps laughing at something on television, felt almost absurd. My existence had once been a question mark in his life. Now I was a fully formed person, standing just beyond the perimeter of his awareness. Driving home, I felt an unexpected wave of grief. Not rage, not bitterness, but something quieter and heavier. I had grown up with a father who chose me, and I had never lacked love. Yet there was still a hollow space where origin should have been. Biology is not everything, but it is something. It is the thread that connects you backward through generations you've never met. Without it, part of your story feels footnoted. Over the next few days, I realized that what I wanted wasn't necessarily a relationship, short, direct acknowledgement, longer simple recognition that I was not a rumor or a regret, others that sounded cautious. None of them felt right. How do you introduce yourself to someone who once chose absence? Hi, I'm the daughter you didn't want. The phrasing felt accusatory even if it was true. I didn't want to begin with blame. I wanted clarity, but clarity requires participation from both sides, and I had no guarantee he would offer it. Eventually, I settled on something simple. I found the business email listed on his website and typed a short message. I introduced myself by name. I stated plainly that I believed he and my mother had known each other many years ago. I asked if he would be willing to meet for a brief conversation. I didn't mention DNA or paternity. I didn't accuse or explain. I kept it neutral, controlled. Before sending, I read it over 5 times, searching for desperation in my tone. I found none, only steadiness. When I clicked send, my hand trembled despite my effort to appear composed. The message disappeared into the digital void, and with it went the illusion that I could return to ignorance. There was no undoing this step. Either he would respond or he wouldn't. Either way, the silence that followed would tell me something. I closed my laptop and sat back in my chair, staring at the blank wall in front of me. For the first time since overhearing that conversation in my grandmother's kitchen, I felt the shift fully. I wasn't just uncovering a secret anymore. I was stepping into it, willingly, knowing it might not welcome me back. The waiting felt endless. Each day I checked my inbox, half expecting a reply, half dreading it. I rehearsed possible conversations in my head, imagining 1,000 ways it could go wrong. What if he didn't recognize me? What if he refused to speak? What if the life he built had no space for someone who belonged to him biologically, but not historically? I oscillated between hope and fear, like the tide pulling me toward shore and then away again. Every email notification made my heart jump, then fall when it wasn't him. Evenings were the hardest, when silence became audible and the house too quiet for my restless thoughts. After a week, a reply arrived, not long, not warm, not welcoming, just 4 lines. I'm surprised, I didn't know, we should meet. How about Thursday? My stomach turned. Relief, apprehension, and a strange weight of responsibility all collided at once. Thursday felt both impossibly far away and immediately urgent. I spent the intervening days cleaning my apartment obsessively, organizing drawers, dusting corners, not because the space was unkempt, but because control over something tangible made the uncertainty of the unknown more bearable. I rehearsed how I would greet him, how I would sit, what questions I could ask without revealing too much too soon. Thursday arrived and I drove to the coffee shop I had chosen. It was neutral territory, quiet, with a large window that looked out onto the street, giving us both an escape route. I arrived early, sat near the window, and sipped my tea, pretending to read a book while scanning the entrance every few minutes. My hand shook slightly, betraying the calm I tried to project. I noticed every detail, the way the barista's hair was tucked behind her ear, the rhythm of cars passing outside, the sharp scent of espresso mixed with baked goods. Every mundane observation grounded me in the present, preventing my mind from spinning into what-ifs. When he walked in, I recognized him immediately from the photographs. Taller in person, broader shoulders, hair less tidy than in any picture, eyes scanning the room as if assessing risk. He froze when our eyes met. I noticed his hesitation, the way he adjusted the strap of his bag nervously, and realized he had rehearsed this moment too. We moved toward each other slowly, unspoken agreement that initial physical distance would remain until words bridged it. I felt a rush of emotion I hadn't anticipated. Recognition, yes, but also something darker, sharper, a prickling sense of betrayal that had been quietly simmering for years. We sat down, the table between us suddenly a chasm both literal and figurative. I studied him, noting the curve of his jaw, the way his hands gripped the menu, the tension in his shoulders. "Thank you for meeting me," I said quietly. He nodded, voice low. I wasn't expecting this." I swallowed, resisting the urge to fill the silence with apologies or justifications. Silence itself was a tool. It demanded acknowledgement without confrontation, forcing the other party to engage with the gravity of what had been left unsaid for decades. My breath steadied, heart slowing. The moment was tense, but it was mine to occupy. I began with neutral questions, small talk about the city, mutual acquaintances, nothing personal. I watched him relax slightly, the tension in his hands loosening. Then I transitioned. "I know who you are," I said carefully. His eyes narrowed slightly, cautious but attentive. "I know about our connection. I need to understand the truth from you." He inhaled sharply, as if the weight of the moment finally registered. "I never knew," he began, voice thick. I didn't know I had a child." There was sincerity, but also confusion, fear of the unknown. I nodded slowly. I didn't come here to accuse, I said. I came to know, to understand what you knew and when. His jaw tightened. I can explain, he said. And then, for the first time in decades, he began. He told me about the months with my mother, his own confusion and youthful indecision, the periods of absence, the moments of fear, the legal decisions he had made without understanding consequences. He spoke haltingly, sometimes rambling, sometimes precise, each word revealing both regret and ignorance. I listened, absorbing, passing, not yet reacting. Every revelation filled gaps I hadn't known were there. For years I had imagined his life, speculated on motives, created scenarios. Now those assumptions were being replaced by raw human complexity, messy, contradictory, and profoundly real. Halfway through the conversation, he paused. I could see him struggling with the enormity of what he had never known and the enormity of what I represented now. I don't even know where to start, he admitted, eyes downcast. Start anywhere, I replied. Start where you can be honest. I can handle the rest. The tone of my voice surprised him. It was calm, controlled, firm without being harsh. I realized I was setting boundaries by sheer presence and poise, teaching him, silently, that acknowledgement came first, and reconciliation would be optional. There was power in clarity, in the deliberate choice to be fully present without surrendering my autonomy. We spent hours in that coffee shop. Details emerged, legal documents, missed opportunities, choices made and avoided. I asked questions, recorded mental notes, pieced together a story that had been fragmented by omission. He answered hesitantly at first, then with more confidence as the narrative took shape. I noticed how he flinched at certain words, how his voice shook when he mentioned my mother, how his hands betrayed internal conflict. I could feel him processing not just the existence of a daughter, but the consequences of absence and the complexity of re-entry into someone's life decades removed. Eventually, he looked up at me, eyes tired but clear. I don't know what to do now, he admitted. I feel like I've been given a second chance I don't deserve. I leaned forward slightly, careful not to close the distance too abruptly. You don't get to decide what you deserve, I said. You get to decide if you show up now. That's the choice, nothing more, nothing less. My tone was measured, deliberate. I wanted him to understand that responsibility doesn't erase the past, but it can define the future. I wasn't angry anymore. I was resolute. The conversation had shifted. What began as discovery had moved into negotiation and tentative understanding. By the end of our meeting, the sun had shifted in the sky, casting long shadows across the floor. We didn't solve everything. There were no promises made, no declarations of ongoing contact, only the beginning of a framework for understanding. I had gained clarity, and he had been confronted with his own history. It was enough. Walking out of the coffee shop, I felt a strange lightness, as if a portion of the weight I had carried alone for years had been dispersed. There was still more to navigate, still more conversation to be had, but the first step had been taken. That night, I journaled extensively. Every word he had spoken, every detail remembered, recorded. I wrote about my emotions, my realizations, and the plan for what came next. I recognized that control, once lost, could be partially reclaimed through preparation, through deliberate documentation, and through understanding. The secret that had once been buried no longer had power over me. It existed, acknowledged, contained, and now the narrative could be guided by intention, not ignorance. I slept differently that night, with a steady heartbeat and an unexpected peace. The next morning, sunlight spilled into my apartment in a way that made everything seem sharper, clearer, more real. I brewed coffee slowly, savoring the ritual, letting the warmth fill my hands and my chest. The previous day's meeting replayed in my mind, each detail a reminder of how fragile yet resilient human connections could be. I wrote notes for a follow-up, not to pressure him, but to clarify my own thoughts. The story of our shared past had begun to untangle, revealing threads I could now weave into a new narrative, one in which I wasn't merely a passive participant, but an active architect of my future. This awareness brought with it both empowerment and caution. I couldn't rush reconciliation, and I wouldn't. By mid-morning, I decided to take a walk, letting the city guide my thoughts. Streets were busier than usual, yet I moved through them as though in a bubble, attuned to my surroundings without being consumed. The way people moved, the snippets of conversation, the hurried laughter of children, all underscored how life persisted, even when secrets and revelations threatened to upend my personal world. I felt connected to the rhythm of it, a participant rather than a spectator. In each step, I felt a growing confidence, an understanding that the choices I made now would ripple through time, shaping more than just my own narrative. I began thinking about the practical steps that would allow our reconnection to be honest, deliberate, and safe. By the time I returned, I had drafted a careful outline. My notes included questions about his life, my mother's intentions, and how he perceived his absence. I also listed boundaries I needed to maintain to protect my emotional well-being. Transparency was crucial, but so was self-preservation. Reintroducing myself into his life couldn't be hasty or unconsidered. I wanted a dialogue, not a confrontation, understanding, not reconciliation on his terms. Every line I wrote reminded me that I could honor the past without surrendering to it. The pen scratched steadily across the page, each word a small assertion of agency. I felt my heartbeat synchronize with the rhythm of planning and reflection, a silent acknowledgement that control had shifted, at least partially, back into my hands. Later, I called an old friend, someone who had known both me and my mother, a witness to the dynamics I had only partially understood. Her voice was warm, yet tinged with surprise when I explained my meeting and the secrets unearthed. "I never imagined this," she said, her tone incredulous yet supportive. "You've handled it with grace." I laughed softly, a sound that surprised even me. Grace wasn't what I had felt during most of the meeting, but it was a choice I could inhabit now. Our conversation meandered from past missteps to current opportunities, and by the end, I felt bolstered, reminded that I was not alone in navigating a story that had seemed too heavy to bear. Each word from her reinforced the idea that history could be acknowledged without being surrendered to. The next few days were a delicate dance. I drafted letters, some intended for him, some only for myself, refining language to capture both truth and tact. I practiced conversations silently, anticipating reactions, adjusting tone and phrasing. Every interaction with the world felt charged, as if the city itself was waiting to see how I would navigate the revelation of our shared secret. I avoided impulsive outreach, understanding that timing mattered more than immediacy. Control over the narrative required patience and observation, and I was willing to wait. By doing so, I reclaimed the power that years of secrecy and misunderstanding had stripped away, asserting my presence in the unfolding story with deliberation and clarity. On the fifth day, I finally drafted a letter addressed to him directly. The words were carefully chosen, not accusatory, not pleading, simply factual and reflective. I outlined the known timeline, my understanding of events, and posed questions that demanded introspection rather than immediate answers. I emphasized boundaries, explaining how contact could be structured safely and respectfully. Sending it felt like both a release and an assertion of authority. I was not waiting passively for him to respond, but extending an invitation for dialogue on my terms. My hand trembled slightly as I sealed the envelope, yet the act itself was empowering, a concrete step in reclaiming the narrative that had been withheld from me. 2 days later, I received a response. He had written on thick stationery, careful handwriting betraying his anxiety. His words were tentative, searching, tinged with both fear and curiosity. He admitted ignorance, confusion, and regret, and expressed a desire to meet again, this time with a more structured plan for conversation. I read the letter multiple times, parsing emotion, gauging sincerity, and noting areas that required clarification or firm boundaries. I felt a sense of cautious optimism, tempered by the awareness that human intentions could shift, Even with a heartfelt letter, follow-through would define the trajectory of our relationship. Trust was a garden that needed careful tending, and I wasn't planting seeds without first ensuring fertile soil. I set the next meeting for a neutral location, a library with private rooms and soft lighting. Arriving early, I felt the familiar pre-meeting tension, but tempered by previous experience. I reviewed notes one last time, organizing my questions, my observations, and the moments I needed to clarify. When he arrived, he seemed more composed than before, but the uncertainty lingered in his posture and the subtle avoidance in his eyes. Our initial small talk was deliberate, almost formal, yet underneath was the mutual understanding that the conversation would shift soon. I felt a mixture of anticipation and resolve. The encounter could deepen understanding or reopen wounds depending on our mutual care and honesty. As the discussion began, I asked about his early years, his memories of my mother, and his understanding of events leading to my absence. His responses were fragmented but sincere, revealing gaps in knowledge, unintentional neglect, and moments of avoidance he had carried for decades. I listened intently, noting discrepancies and corroborations, not to catch him in falsehoods, but to map the truth against my own memories. The process was exhausting but illuminating, providing context for past behaviors and clarifying intent versus impact. I found a rhythm, interspersing questions with reflections and occasional silence, allowing the weight of words to settle between us. By the end of our meeting, a delicate trust had begun to emerge. Not reconciliation, not yet, but mutual acknowledgement of history and responsibility. He promised to continue sharing details, answering questions honestly, and respecting boundaries I had set. I felt a profound relief, a validation of years of endurance, patience, and careful observation. Leaving the library, the air felt lighter, the world sharper, and my own heartbeat steadier. The secret that had once isolated me was now shared, and in that sharing, the foundation for potential understanding had been laid. The day had begun as a continuation of fear and ended with the faint glimmer of possibility. The days following our library meeting settled into a rhythm, each morning carrying the soft hum of anticipation. I spent my hours cataloguing old photographs, letters, and mementos, piecing together the timeline of a family history that had been fractured by omission and misunderstanding. Every item told a story, a fragment of truth waiting to be aligned with the narratives we had uncovered. I created folders, meticulously labeling each, writing notes in the margins, sometimes laughing softly at memories once painful, now tinged with clarity. This act of organization wasn't just administrative, it was symbolic. I was reclaiming control, asserting that the past could be acknowledged on my terms, without distortion, without fear. Afternoons became walks through the neighborhood, familiar streets now imbued with new awareness. I noticed details previously overlooked, the way light hit the old oak at the corner, the pattern of bricks in the walkway, children playing tag, neighbors exchanging brief smiles. Each observation reminded me that life moved forward, that the world existed beyond my family's secret, and that I had a role in shaping the environment I inhabited. It was a lesson in perspective, how history and present could coexist without one suffocating the other. I felt a quiet empowerment, a certainty that whatever came next, I would navigate it with deliberate intention and measured patience. One evening, I revisited the letters exchanged with my son, reading them side by side, marking phrases, highlighting tones, noting patterns in word choice. His words reflected both remorse and confusion. Mine reflected observation and restraint. I realized that communication was less about convincing and more about revealing, about presenting reality in a way that could not be ignored. The realization deepened my understanding of influence. We can only offer truth, never enforce its reception. Acceptance, like forgiveness, must be voluntary, and I recognized that my role was to provide clarity, to hold boundaries, and to maintain dignity in every interaction. This insight became a guiding principle in our evolving relationship. Late nights were spent drafting what I began to think of as a family chronicle. I wrote with precision, alternating between past events and reflections on their meaning, noting patterns of behavior, repeated choices, and consequences. Writing in this structured way helped me disentangle emotions from facts, separating what had been done from how it had affected me. I labeled sections carefully: memory, observation, consequence, and intention. By documenting in this fashion, I could approach future conversations without being swept into reactive emotions. The chronicle became both shield and tool, preserving evidence and providing a framework for deliberate dialogue. It reminded me that history, once recorded, could no longer be denied. A week later, I invited my son for another conversation. This time, I chose my apartment, neutral yet personal, filled with objects that represented my life, my choices, and my independence. I set the table with care, a quiet signal that this was not casual, but intentional. When he arrived, the tension was palpable, tempered by tentative recognition of shared history. We spoke cautiously at first, then gradually moved into deeper territory: decisions made, secrets kept, and the unspoken consequences of those actions. I framed each question not as accusation, but as a means of understanding, emphasizing the distinction between intention and impact, between memory and perception. My calm, deliberate approach encouraged him to reflect rather than react. He admitted mistakes, omissions, and misunderstandings. He explained choices that, though logical from his perspective, caused harm. I listened without interruption, letting his words settle. I asked clarifying questions, not to punish, but to illuminate the pathways that led to pain and misunderstanding. We explored his fears, his assumptions about my knowledge and intentions, and his own unexamined biases. The conversation was long, occasionally uncomfortable, but constructive. I realized that the power of dialogue lay not in victory, but in shared acknowledgement, in the ability to lay bare truths without expecting immediate resolution. In doing so, we created a foundation for measured reconciliation, or at least coexistence, built on clarity rather than assumption. In the days following that conversation, I noticed subtle changes in his behavior. He reached out more frequently, not intrusively, but with intent to communicate, to share, to rebuild trust slowly. I reciprocated selectively, responding with transparency, but maintaining the boundaries I had established. This gradual exchange reinforced a principle I had discovered. Rebuilding relationships is less about grand gestures and more about consistent, deliberate action over time. Each interaction became a test of patience, discernment, and emotional intelligence, a quiet exercise in observing without being engulfed, in giving without being depleted. The slow cadence of communication allowed both of us to reassess, reflect, and adjust our expectations. During these weeks, I also focused on personal growth outside the family context. I enrolled in a creative writing class, revisiting skills I had set aside for decades, and immersed myself in projects that challenged and invigorated me. Painting, journaling, and even casual photography became vehicles for self-expression, helping me process the layers of emotion intertwined with family secrets. I discovered a renewed sense of identity, independent of my son or our shared history. Each creative act reinforced the principle that I could thrive beyond the narratives imposed upon me, that personal fulfillment need not be contingent on reconciliation or approval from others. One morning, I received an unexpected call from a distant relative, someone who had only heard fragments of our family's story. She expressed curiosity and concern, and I decided to share a measured version of events, mindful of privacy, but committed to honesty. The conversation was enlightening. Her perspective offered insights I hadn't considered, nuances that clarified motivations and reactions across generations. I realized that truth is multidimensional, and understanding requires listening to multiple voices, including those previously excluded. The act of sharing selectively, thoughtfully, and responsibly became another tool in navigating the complex terrain of family dynamics. By the end of the month, the atmosphere around our interactions shifted subtly but noticeably. Conversations became less tense, more thoughtful, and imbued with a sense of accountability. I observed small gestures of respect, acknowledgement, and effort on his part, and I responded with patience, reinforcement, and measured encouragement. Trust, though still fragile, was slowly regaining form, like a structure being rebuilt with careful, deliberate engineering. Each day reinforced the lesson that healing, like construction, requires time, attention, and unwavering commitment to integrity. The past remained present, but its power over us diminished as deliberate action reshaped the narrative. The following weeks were a study in quiet observation and measured interaction, each moment layered with significance. I noticed the subtle ways my son began to integrate the lessons from our conversations into his daily routine. He paused before speaking, considered phrasing, and occasionally sought my input before acting. These small shifts, almost imperceptible, carried profound weight. They were evidence that even deeply ingrained habits, patterns cultivated over decades, could be altered through patient guidance and unwavering boundaries. I felt a renewed sense of purpose, not as a director of his life, but as a witness and occasional guide, offering insight without commandeering action. My role had transformed, becoming less about confrontation and more about steady influence. Evenings were dedicated to reflection. I pored over the family chronicle, adding context, clarifying timelines, and noting emotional resonances that emerged from recent dialogues. Each entry allowed me to reconcile memories with present realities, bridging gaps that had once felt insurmountable. Writing became a meditation, a deliberate act of organizing not just facts, but feelings, allowing me to process grief, anger, and hope simultaneously. I realized that control over narrative was not control over people, but mastery over one's own perception and reaction. This clarity, once elusive, was now tangible, grounding me in a way that made each decision more confident, each interaction more deliberate, each boundary more unassailable. During these evenings, I also reconnected with extended family, long-neglected relationships that had suffered collateral damage from the secrecy and tension in my immediate family. Conversations flowed cautiously at first, then deepened, revealing shared experiences, mutual regrets, and opportunities for understanding. I became aware of patterns repeating across generations, how miscommunication and hidden truths created rifts that persisted if left unaddressed. By acknowledging these patterns openly, I began fostering a culture of accountability and transparency that extended beyond my son, reinforcing the importance of integrity in relationships. Each reconnection was a deliberate step in reinforcing my role not merely as a participant but as a catalyst for clarity. On weekends, I devoted time to creative pursuits. Painting and writing became tools for exploring emotions I couldn't articulate in conversation. Colors, textures, and words allowed me to externalize feelings that had once been internalized, suppressed, or misdirected. Each completed canvas or written passage was a tangible manifestation of control over my own narrative, a declaration that I could create meaning even when the past felt fragmented. These acts, initially personal, began to influence my environment as well. I rearranged furniture to maximize sunlight, added touches of greenery, and curated spaces that reflected calm, strength, and independence. My home became both sanctuary and statement, embodying resilience and autonomy. One Tuesday morning, he arrived unexpectedly, knocking gently at the door. I invited him in cautiously, aware that old dynamics could resurface. He apologized for intrusions and miscommunications, acknowledging patterns he had only recently recognized. I listened without judgment, allowing him to speak fully before responding. Our dialogue was structured but flexible, rooted in observation and honesty. I asked probing questions about his intentions, his understanding of consequences, and his commitment to change. His responses were measured, occasionally faltering, but always earnest. I felt cautious optimism. Trust, once broken, required sustained effort, but effort was visible, and that visibility mattered profoundly. Afternoons were dedicated to collaborative projects. We organized old family documents together, comparing recollections, verifying dates, and noting gaps. The exercise, though tedious at times, was therapeutic. It allowed us to engage without confrontation, to establish shared responsibility, and to anchor discussions in tangible evidence rather than emotions alone. I realized that reconciliation was not solely about conversation, but about building frameworks for accountability and transparency. Each document handled, each date clarified, was a brick in the foundation of a relationship rebuilt on clarity and intention. Evenings were often quiet, spent reading aloud together. Literature became a bridge, providing common ground and shared experiences beyond personal history. We discussed characters' motivations, choices, and consequences, drawing parallels to our own lives. These discussions, indirect yet profound, allowed us to explore ethical and emotional dimensions safely. They created a space where vulnerability was possible without risk of exploitation or judgment. Through literature, we discovered a new way of connecting, one rooted in empathy, critical thinking, and shared insight. Weekends occasionally included outings into the city. Museums, parks, and theaters became neutral grounds for interaction. Observing art or engaging with nature allowed conversation to flow more naturally, often revealing insights otherwise difficult to access. The shared experiences became a new narrative layer, one that neither erased the past nor ignored it, but enriched the context for understanding. I noted how he began to mirror subtle habits, pausing before speaking, acknowledging my contributions, demonstrating awareness of space and consent. These behaviors, small but consistent, marked tangible progress in a relationship previously defined by absence and secrecy. Late nights were spent planning future family initiatives. I envisioned gatherings that were inclusive yet structured, opportunities for extended family to engage without rekindling past tensions. I drafted frameworks for communication, defining acceptable boundaries, expected behaviors, and contingency plans for potential conflicts. I shared these plans cautiously with him, emphasizing collaboration rather than imposition. This strategic approach ensured that while the past informed decisions, it did not dictate outcomes. We were creating a culture of transparency, mutual respect, and accountability, built deliberately and thoughtfully, with space for mistakes, but without tolerance for neglect or disregard. By the end of the month, the atmosphere surrounding our interactions had shifted fundamentally. Trust, though still tentative, had stabilized. Conversations were increasingly honest, reflective, and constructive. Boundaries were respected consistently, and mutual understanding, while incomplete, had deepened. I felt a profound sense of agency and clarity. The secret that once isolated me had been integrated into our shared narrative, not as a source of shame, but as a catalyst for deliberate connection. The past remained present, yet it no longer constrained or defined our engagement. We were co-authoring a future rooted in truth, respect, and careful reconciliation, one measured step at a time. The final weeks were quieter, almost serene, marked by reflection and subtle growth. I watched my son navigate life with newfound awareness, his actions measured, his words thoughtful, a stark contrast to the impulsive behaviors of the past. Our interactions became less about confrontation and more about mutual recognition, acknowledging mistakes, understanding impact, and cautiously celebrating progress. I noticed the small gestures, a pause before interrupting, a genuine inquiry about my opinions, a willingness to share responsibility without being prompted. These shifts, though subtle, signified that change, once seeded, could flourish with patience and consistent reinforcement. I focused on my personal projects, pouring creativity into writing, painting, and journaling. Each act was a reclamation of voice and agency, a tangible affirmation that my life, shaped by decades of experience, could still evolve and thrive. I documented lessons, compiled insights, and created spaces for reflection that allowed both past and present to coexist without conflict. I shared some of these works selectively, not for validation, but to inspire understanding and connection, bridging gaps that had long been widened by secrecy and misunderstanding. Our home, once a symbol of tension and unspoken resentment, transformed into a space of calm and intentionality. Gardens flourished, rooms were organized for comfort, and personal touches reflected the resilience and independence I had cultivated. The environment became a silent teacher, demonstrating that order, beauty, and structure were reflections of inner clarity and strength. Each decision reinforced the principle that personal peace was not contingent on others' recognition, but on deliberate action and self-respect. Family gatherings, when they occurred, were navigated with clear boundaries. I maintained control over timing, location, and interactions, ensuring that shared spaces did not become arenas for past grievances. Dialogue was intentional, reflective, and grounded in fact rather than assumption. Observing these interactions, I recognized the profound importance of structure, patience, and emotional intelligence in fostering sustainable relationships. The lessons of the secret we uncovered had evolved into principles guiding daily conduct and long-term engagement. My relationship with my grandson deepened naturally, rooted in trust, care, and shared experience. We explored hobbies, shared meals, and created rituals that reinforced stability and emotional safety. I observed how his growth mirrored the lessons I had cultivated in myself and in my son. Patience, honesty, and deliberate action could create environments where trust and respect flourished. These moments offered a profound sense of fulfillment, a reminder that even after betrayal and secrecy, the capacity for meaningful connection remained. Reflecting on the journey, I understood that the family secret had not only revealed hidden truths, but had also provided an opportunity for transformation. It prompted honest assessment, deliberate action, and the cultivation of boundaries that protected well-being while encouraging accountability. The challenge was not simply to uncover truth, but to integrate it into a framework that allowed healing, growth, and empowerment for everyone willing to engage with integrity. I realized that peace was not found in confrontation alone, nor in revenge, but in the consistent assertion of agency and clarity. By maintaining composure, articulating expectations, and establishing accountability, I had created a foundation that could support authentic relationships while safeguarding my autonomy. The narrative of secrecy, once a source of pain, had become a tool for empowerment, offering lessons in resilience, discernment, and intentionality. In the quiet mornings that followed, I watched the world from my porch, the light shifting over familiar landscapes, the garden thriving with new life. I felt gratitude for the clarity we had achieved, the boundaries we had set, and the growth that had emerged from a place of past deception. My son's silence, once oppressive, was now a reflection of reflection rather than avoidance. I embraced this stillness, understanding that patience, observation, and integrity had transformed not only our relationships, but the very fabric of our family's story. And so, as I closed the chronicle, carefully filed letters, and set aside notes, I recognized that life's truths, once unearthed, required both courage and discipline to integrate. Secrets, when faced with honesty and careful intention, could catalyze growth, create accountability, and foster the conditions for reconciliation, or at the very least, mutual respect. I breathed deeply, savoring the quiet, knowing that the day we uncovered our family's biggest secret had not destroyed us but had, in fact, set the stage for transformation, understanding, and enduring peace.